I was at a worship service recently, and it was, one of those ones with the really good band, not like what I just did there, but like the good band and the good sound system, and it was just really happening, and lots of people were really excited. And I was thinking about that and the difference between that and, say, meeting in a house church in a country or a nation where Christianity is not able to be as open as we are here. What would happen to us if we lost the ability to practice our faith in the way that we do? I think a lot of us would have a hard time, because a lot of times we equate, if we don't equate our faith with attending church and doing certain religious things at church, we sometimes get strength for our faith from doing those things, right? And it's sort of the pattern of how we work. We say, okay, well, I'm going to go to church, and that will be my faith time of the week, and I will get to think about God, and I will get to hear from the Bible, and I will get to learn some things, and then that should carry me and sustain me through the rest of the week. And what if that weren't possible? What if everything you knew about how you connect with God suddenly became completely the opposite? That's what happens with Daniel and the Hebrews that are in the book of Daniel. So I want to start with reading a good chunk of the first chapter of Daniel. I'm going to draw some parallels from it. I'm going to give you a few thoughts about it, and then we're going to have some conversation about it. We do that every week. We give everybody the opportunity to discuss what they're hearing and what they think about it, and that opens up all kinds of new ideas. Daniel and the people of Israel are taken into captive in the beginning of the book of Daniel, taken into captivity to Babylon. There are a lot of parallels to Babylon and modern American Western culture. Dave Kinnaman, who's the president of Barna Research Group, wrote, "At its worst, today's Western culture is indulgent, distracted, idol-following, and hedonistic. This time and place may be different, but the tension of living in but not of lives describes the challenge of the faithful both then and now." And he's talking about the time that Daniel and Israel is taken into captivity to Babylon. The time and place may be different, but the tension of living in but not of lives describes the challenge of the faithful. And if you read in Daniel chapter 1, if you have a Bible, you can read along with me and laugh at my inability to pronounce these really big names. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. I like that. He just kind of came along. Well, he also brought, tens of thousands of dudes with him, probably hundreds of thousands. He besieged it. He took it over. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, who is the king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. The first thing you notice about this story is that yes, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came along, but Daniel writes that God delivered the Israelites into his hand. So this is God's doing. Now there's a lot going on here that God is punishing Israel for not following his decrees and laws and all those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, the people who are taken in captivity into Babylon have an understanding that this is at God's hand, that God has purpose in what he's doing, and we find ourselves in the middle of what God is doing, and it's not good. If you think about what it was like to be Jewish in that system, then this means your entire system of religion is gone. It's irrelevant. They're dislocated. They're taken into captivity. Their nation is gone. Their national sovereignty is gone. And a lot of people in American church are kind of mourning the same thing, that Christianity is no longer the center of our culture. Michael Frost said, "The experience that the Jewish exiles faced mirrors the church's experience today. In fact, the biblical metaphor that best suits our current times and faith situation is that of exile. Just like the Jewish exiles, the church is grieving its loss and struggling with humiliation. There's this idea that we used to understand how to have faith be the center of culture, and now that's no longer true. And in fact, more and more, our culture is less and less interested in the ideas of the Bible and in the ideas of Jesus and in our ideas as Christian people. And so we have one of two options. We can either contract in and pretend that's not happening, and we can try and make our internal things better and better and better and pretend that the world around us isn't changing. Or we can decide to figure out how we can live a different understanding of how we worship, how we reach others, how we live in this culture where our faith is increasingly irrelevant. And you know that it's increasingly irrelevant. You talk to people and it's just a basic assumption that Christianity makes no sense. I go to work and folk are not sitting around saying, boy, I've really been considering the ideas of Jesus a lot lately. I've really been thinking about that. Now, they might talk to me about considering the ideas of Buddhism. They might talk to me about considering the ideas of Eastern religions. They might talk to me about, I was having a conversation the other day with someone about the different levels of something or the other in yoga and calm and some things like that. But they're not sitting around saying, yeah, boy, I've been reading the Bible and I had some thoughts about it. In fact, it's sort of the opposite. They're a little bit more hostile toward the idea. It's sort of the way that the Babylonians would have looked at the Jewish religion of the day. It's kind of a backwater place. When the exiles are taken into captivity in Babylon, they're going from a very small world into a very big world. The Babylonian Empire spans a massive land area. And so that's what happens. The king ordered some guy whose name I can't pronounce, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. So this is indoctrination. This is brainwashing. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. So these guys are taken from their homes. They're brought to Babylon. They're put on a 3-year college indoctrination course where it's day and night learning the language and literature of the Babylonians and eating from the king's table, food offered to idols, that sort of thing. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. There's a whole study you can do on those names and what they mean, and they're actually very significant names that have to do with the Jewish faith. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. And this is where we get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Abednego if you say it wrong like I did when I was a kid. Or as my parents were so cute to say, Shadrach, Meshach, and into bed we go is a bedtime story, right? So wrong. These are also significant names. If you look at what these names mean, they didn't give them new names because they had trouble pronouncing their old names. They gave them new names to change their character. These names are actually names that are meant to honor their gods. Just one of them, Belteshazzar, basically means worshiper of Bel, who's one of their gods. And so Daniel gets the name Belteshazzar, and he has a name that is about worshiping his God, and now he's been given a new name that is about worshiping a God he doesn't accept or believe in, and then he's to be indoctrinated. He's to be called by a name that honors Babylonian gods and magic. Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. That's an important phrase. God had caused the official to show favor. There's really no reason Daniel can expect to have any favor with anybody because he's a slave. He's been taken into captivity. He is a member of a people that have been conquered. And yet God gives him favor with this chief official. But even the favor that God gave him, the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you. And so Daniel doesn't get what he needs from the chief official. Now he goes to the next guy down the line. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and to drink and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this, and he tested him for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. And by the way, some folk have taken this verse and said, you see, we should all be vegetarians. That's what this verse is really all about. What's actually happening here, and by the way, we probably all should, that'd work out pretty well, but meat is tasty. This is actually not a rule about vegetarianism. This is a choice that they're making because the food and the wine has been offered to idols, and it's forbidden for them to eat, and so they don't want to defile themselves with this. There's an interesting thing that a lot of people miss. I wonder if you've picked up on it yet. We'll get to it in a second. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables, water instead. You know what's interesting here? They negotiated. They didn't say, well, you know, and these are young men, probably in their late teens, early 20s. They've been taken away from everything they know, and now they're in this new world. And they're in this indoctrination program, and they're learning all these new things. And they have to very quickly make decisions about their faith, right? And how am I going to live out my faith in this new reality? And that's where we find ourselves too. How do I live out my faith in this new reality when all of the old defaults just aren't there? All of the easy things are just not there. Everybody, you know, doesn't respect my faith. Everybody doesn't say, oh yeah, having Sunday off so you can go to church. Sure, absolutely. That used to be a given in America. It's not. So they have to make these decisions really quickly, and you see that they negotiated. And did you notice what they didn't say no to? They said no to the food. They said, okay, this is a line too far for us. But they said, okay, well, if you want us to eat the food, we will. However, let's do a test first. So here's this, you know, going down the line of different officials and negotiating. The thing they didn't say no to was the language or the literature. Isn't that interesting? They didn't say no to this indoctrination program. They said, okay, teach us your language, teach us your literature, teach us whatever you want us to know. But there are certain things we don't want to do. They stepped out in their faith and they said, okay, let's see what happens when we follow God's laws. Let's see if we do better than everybody else. And they give God an opportunity in their life to show up on their behalf in the same way that God gave Daniel favor with the official. To these 4 young men, verse 17, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel specifically could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. How very interesting. God gives Daniel this very specific gift because the king has a very specific need and the culture has a very specific bent to it. They respect magicians and they respect wizards and people who understand, you know, mystical, spiritual things. And God gives Daniel this very specific gift to understand visions and dreams of all kinds Where did Daniel get this ability? Well, it's certainly not from the Babylonians. They didn't teach him enough from their literature and their language for him to have this ability. And we know that because of the next verses. At the end of the time set by the king to bring him into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked to them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. They had better understanding than whom? Magicians and enchanters? So this is a culture that believes that magicians and enchanters know stuff. They believe that they are wise. We would say magicians and enchanters are weird. In this culture, they respect magicians and enchanters, and yet Daniel has 10 times the knowledge, and all of the other men with him have 10 times the knowledge of any enchanter or magician in the entire kingdom. They were admired for being something they were not. Isn't that interesting? That God puts them in this place, and they have all of this respect now with this new kingdom. Even though this kingdom doesn't understand who they are and where they're from, they find that they are wise beyond their ability to understand. And Daniel remained there until the first year of the king of Cyrus. So week 1 here, I wanted to say welcome to Babylon. That's what happened to Daniel and the boys. They got their big welcome to Babylon. They got 3 years of indoctrination. Some biblical historians say that they were made eunuchs, which, wow, bummer. But they were put into the king's service. They are now embedded into a foreign superpower that they had no intention of being a part of that culture. They've gone from a small world into a very, very big world. They've learned a lot of new language and literature and all those kinds of things. And we always talk about the story of Daniel in the lion's den, which we will. And we'll talk about these 3 guys in the fiery furnace. But you got to realize that those things didn't happen the first week they got into Babylon. The first week, their welcome to Babylon is having to make simple decisions and having to make quick negotiations about how they're going to live out their faith in this new context. And we live there, and God put us there. And all of us who will get up tomorrow and go out very purposefully into the world that we live and work and take care of kids and all those kinds of things in, we have to say, okay, we are just like those guys in the middle of this larger context. So how do we live like God intends us to? Because it's not as simple as saying, well, I just go to church on Sunday and I read the Bible sometimes, and everybody else pretty much agrees with the Bible. So if I ever wanted to share with anybody about Jesus, I could just say, hey, you know about Jesus, right? You should follow him. Okay, good. A few points. We have to make decisions about our faith and our purpose, what to hold on to, what to negotiate. Default positions are in this new context alien. And we've been talking about that since last August. We've been saying, you know, the normal ways of doing things that we've always done for hundreds of years in the American church, we have to think about them. We have to think about what really gives us an opportunity to speak truth into someone's life. It may not be as simple. I was talking to a friend the other day. It may not be as simple as saying, hey, would you come to church with me? Because there are a lot of people I know who will never come to church with me, but they might talk to me about Jesus, and they might talk to me about my faith, especially if what happened to Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah can happen in my life, where God gives me favor in the eyes of people, and that gives me an opportunity to talk about who my God is. And as you read through the rest of the book of Daniel, you'll see what happens is, as these guys begin to have favor with all the people, and they seem to be 10 times more wise than everybody else, what happens is they are in the middle of that big pagan culture creating such a difference in the minds and the hearts of everyone around them that there are more than once proclamations to the entire known world that the God of the Hebrews is a real God. And all of a sudden, the truth about God gets amplified because they're in this new alien kind of a position. So we have to make decisions about our faith and purpose. What do we hold on to? What do we negotiate? What are the most important things? Second, we have to balance the act of submitting to an earthly authority that is set against God, while at the same time trusting God to sustain us. Mr. Jerry isn't here, but we talk often about working in the public education system and how he has to balance submitting to that earthly authority that says you can't say anything about your faith and you can't say anything about God and you can't be open about what you believe, and yet at the same time being a person of deep faith and deep conviction and loving Jesus with all of his heart and wanting to tell the whole world about him. And so you have to balance the act of submitting to an earthly authority set against God while at the same time trusting that God will get his message out through you some way and somehow. And that's exactly what Daniel and the boys had to do. They had to submit to the authority and yet somehow balance that with submitting to God. These Hebrews were willing, thirdly, in order to serve God, to be fully in this foreign culture, even as they were negotiating and figuring out how to not be of it, right? They accepted, we're going to learn, we're going to figure out what's going on, we're going to accept positions of authority. It's funny sometimes talking with American Christians, they go, well, you know, I don't want to be in a position of influence outside of the church world. And yet, here were these young men willing to accept positions of authority, and as we go on, you'll see just how extreme those positions of authority get. But they're willing, in order to serve God, to be fully in that foreign culture. And throughout their life, they figure out better and better ways to be in it, but not be of it. And it does come to a point, at some point, where they have to say absolutely no, and they draw a line, and they get thrown into fire for it, and then other things happen. I have less dramatic examples I'll share with you of times in my life when I've had to say in professional settings, absolutely not, because this violates my faith, and I won't do it, I won't be part of it. Sometimes that results in you getting pulled out of the fiery furnace, and sometimes you get fired. So we'll talk about all of those opportunities too. So let's take a few minutes and talk. And I actually don't have one last thing tonight because I think I've talked a whole lot, but I have a bunch of questions that we can talk about. And I hope that you're kind of getting the idea of what I'm saying from this story. This is about us. Oh, those are just tiny, tiny letters today, aren't they? All right, if you need to stand really close to it, Brad, or use a magnifying glass, go ahead. I'll read them to you so you have them in your head. And I want us to just spend a few minutes talking, and then I'll close in prayer in about 10 minutes, and then you can talk as long as you want to. In what ways is our current situation like that of the exiles in Babylon? And in what ways is this different? There are some differences, and there are some similarities. Do you think some people saw their actions, meaning Daniel and Azariah and Hananiah and the other guys, as compromise or even sin? I mean, imagine the guys who are still back in Jerusalem. Imagine the guys who are still back in Judah saying, oh man, Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah, and these used to be very important people in our culture. Now they're in Babylon, and I hear that they're even leaders in Babylon. They're even in charge of things in the Babylonian government. When you think about the path American culture is on, do you believe our society will become more open or less open to the Christian faith? Not a trick question, just something to think about. Can you think of a time when you have been elevated in the eyes of those outside your faith, specifically because of your faith, or known someone who has? That's what happened to these young men. They made choices based on their faith, and God elevated them because of it. And the last one, how can we be more like Daniel and the Boys, which is also on my list of really good band names. All right, so take a few minutes, talk amongst yourselves, and I'll just close in prayer in a little bit.